If you run a company or manage a team, hiring qualified people quickly can make or break your business. Imagine a position of need going unfilled for weeks or even months because you just can't seem to find the right candidate. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. Indeed sponsored jobs help you stand out and hire fast. With sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates so you can reach the people you want faster. This makes a huge difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Plus, there's no monthly subscriptions, no long-term contracts. You only pay for results on your job post. Just in the last minute that I've been talking to you, 23 hires were made on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. Now that is fast. There's no need to wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. Listeners will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/BWN. Go to Indeed.com/BWN right now to support this podcast. Indeed.com/BWN. Terms and conditions apply.
From your favorite source for Chicago White Sox talk, delivering news, interviews, analysis, and more. This is the Sox Machine podcast with your hosts, Jim Margulis, James Fegan, and Josh Nelson.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome to the Sox Machine podcast. I'm your host, Josh Nelson, and it's Friday night, February 21st, 2025, as we bring you a new episode. In this show, we start our 2025 American League Central previews, learning about the Chicago White Sox divisional rivals. We'll have each week, starting with the Detroit Tigers. Cody Stavenhagen of The Athletic is the Tigers beat reporter, and he'll join me later in the show to talk about the Tigers' plans for 2025 and why the first half of the season is critical, knowing that starting pitcher Tarik Skubal, a Scott Boras client, is approaching free agency after the 2026 season. If the Tigers struggle in the first half, could Skubal be traded? But first, the Chicago White Sox made some news late Thursday night. Fansided reporter Robert Murray tweeted that the Chicago White Sox had signed pitcher Mike Clevinger to a minor league contract. This is now the third contract the White Sox have signed Clevinger to for those keeping score at home. Last season, Clevinger was hurt and bad. He didn't make his first appearance until May 6th, which he got hit around in 2 innings of work, not even striking out a batter against Tampa Bay. His next 3 starts, Clevinger couldn't get out of the 5th inning. The very last start by Clevinger was on May 23rd against Baltimore, in which he allowed 5 earned runs thanks to 2 home runs. After that, Clevinger was done, and it was thought his tenure with the White Sox was over. At Camelback Ranch, White Sox general manager Chris Getz shared his reasoning on bringing back Clevinger.
Unfortunately, last year, Clev, really couldn't get going with the injury, primarily with his neck, and he had a procedure done that he feels and the doctors feel that is behind him now, and so we felt like bringing him into camp on a non-roster, getting a chance to show us if he can help our team in some capacity was, a worthy look. We went to go see him this offseason while he was throwing a side session. We've been tracking, his pitch data that he has shared with us, and we're curious enough to see what it looks like in a minor league deal.
The fan reaction to the signing, which checking social media and Sox Machine comments, it's not very welcoming. Even though Clevinger was not suspended by Major League Baseball for domestic violence, it has still created an uneasiness about his involvement with the White Sox since 2023. Getz did speak about the possible fan reaction to the signing and what consideration he took how fans would respond when signing Clevinger.
Part of the consideration, because it's been associated with Clev. With that being said, we've been around Clev for the last couple of years. I know how he is respected with his teammates and everyone in the clubhouse. We're also we've learned more about the situation, and we're comfortable with it.
So what's the game plan with Clevinger? Here's Getz about the White Sox plans working with Clevinger during spring training.
Through the years, obviously, he understands, what it takes from a, workload capacity as a starter. Last year with that injury, he had a tough time, going deeper into games. So we're going to start small here. And like I said, I think, getting a look in shorter stints, could be exciting to see, if his stuff plays up and he responds well from a health standpoint.
Opening the door for Clevinger to be part of the bullpen makes it easier for him to go from minor league deal to a spot on the 26-man roster. Getz sounds excited to see if Clevinger's stuff actually plays up in shorter outings.
We're open-minded in terms of role. I know that he is as well. I've always had a little bit of a curiosity of what it could look like in a bullpen role. He's someone that wants a look, and we're willing to give him one.
Without knowing who the closer is at this moment, could Clevinger get consideration in closing out games for the White Sox in 2025?
Got weapons that can get both-sided hitters out. He's got the mentality to do it, and he's pitched in big moments at the major league level. So he's got traits that indicate that he could be good at any role in the bullpen, including the back end.
Again, Clevinger's on a minor league deal and has to prove to the White Sox he's both healthy and effective throwing off the mound. It's unclear if Clevinger didn't make the White Sox opening day roster, if he would accept a demotion to Charlotte and then wait for his turn to join the team from AAA. We'll see how things go, but the White Sox already received a dead cat bounce performance from Clevinger back in 2023. And again, sometimes a dead cat is just a dead cat. Meanwhile, Saturday is the start of White Sox spring training games as they play against the Chicago Cubs. You can watch the game on the Marquee Network or MLB.tv. ESPN 1000 AM will have the radio call. First pitch is at 2:05 p.m. Central Time, and our Sox Machine beat reporter James Fegan will be on site. Wednesday night, March 26th, will be Opening Day Eve, co-hosted by Sox Machine and our friends from the 108 at the Ramova Theater. Come join us as we get ready for another season of Chicago White Sox baseball, or at least pretend to be excited. Special guests include Jim Callis of MLB.com, as he'll talk about the top White Sox prospects and answer your questions live about the farm system. Courtney Finicum of Baseball is Not Boring podcast. She stole the show last year and is ready to dish her predictions for 2025. Jim Margulis and James Fegan will have a live PO Sox segment to answer questions from the audience, and our friends from the 108 will close out the show by making their very wild and entertaining predictions, including the famous steak dinner bet between Beefloaf and I. Tickets are just $20, doors open at 6 p.m., and the show will start at 7:30 p.m. Purchase your tickets at RamovaChicago.com or in the ticket link in this podcast post on SoxMachine.com. In more exciting news within White Sox circles, reporting from John Greenberg and Dan Hayes of The Athletic, a seismic shift has occurred regarding ownership within Major League Baseball. Billionaire investor Justin Ishbia, who is co-owner of the Phoenix Suns and Phoenix Mercury basketball teams, with his brother Matt, has pivoted from efforts in purchasing the Minnesota Twins to purchasing more minority shares within the Chicago White Sox. Justin Ishbia is currently a minority owner of the White Sox, as back in 2021, he and Michael Reinsdorf were buying out minority owners' shares who wanted to liquidate their holdings. In the report, Ishbia is buying shares at a $1.8 billion valuation. According to the reporting from John Greenberg and Dan Hayes, White Sox Limited Partners were recently informed that an investor wanted to buy their shares at a franchise valuation around $1.8 billion, according to people briefed on the discussions who are not authorized to speak publicly. While they aren't required to sell, their stakes would be diluted by this new investor. The deadline for their decision is next Friday. Next Friday is February 28th. Now, just because Ishbia buys more minority shares, it doesn't position him to do a hostile takeover of the Chicago White Sox. Ishbia would still need Reinsdorf to sell his shares to him. A reminder that Reinsdorf turns 89 years old on February 25th. Perhaps having a clearer succession plan could help efforts in developing Project 78, knowing that an established billionaire already in Chicago could take over as the next owner of the Chicago White Sox. Something to ponder, but Ishbia's pivot impacts the Minnesota Twins a great deal, as it's reported that they believed Ishbia's efforts to be sincere in buying the club. Now the Twins have to find a serious buyer or buyers, as they had the goal of selling before opening day.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Nerds Gummy Clusters, the sweet treat that always elevates the vibe. With a sweet gummy surrounded with tangy, crunchy nerds, every bite of Nerds Gummy Clusters brings you a whole new world of flavor. Whether it's game night, on the way to a concert, or kicking back with your crew, unleash your senses with Nerds Gummy Clusters.
Join us now to start our preview of the other American League Central teams as a friend of the podcast. Covering the Detroit Tigers for The Athletic, it's Cody Stavenhagen. And Cody, thanks for coming back on the Sox Machine podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh. Always a pleasure.
Before we get to the Tigers, we ran into you, James Fegan and I, at Sox Fest. We were surprised to see you at Sox Fest. Why is the Tigers writer at Sox Fest? And you informed us you were writing a feature story on The Athletic about new White Sox manager Will Venable, bringing to some light details of the interview process that we weren't exactly aware of, like the writing portion that started the interview process. All the candidates had to have written answers to select questions that weeded out people, and the interviews at the St. Regis Hotel, very fancy. The premise of your feature, though, is why did Will Venable take the White Sox gig? And in some ways, Cody, towards the end of February, a lot of us are still asking ourselves that question, and even Will himself, why did you take this gig? After interviewing people close to him and talking to Will Venable and Chris Getz, why do you think Will Venable took the White Sox job?
Well, yeah, first, thanks for reading and mentioning the story. I do a little bit of national work now beyond Tigers and always catch people off guard if I pop up somewhere else. But, Will Venable was kind enough to sit down with me, largely because I wanted to answer that question, especially from the outside looking in. It was kind of fascinating. This guy who has interviewed for a lot of other jobs, who passed up interviews with the Mets and Guardians an offseason ago, takes of all jobs the White Sox, it seemed, coming off a record for most losses and maybe with not the most clear path forward. It's pretty interesting. I think I did come away with a little insight. He did admit you never know when the phone's going to stop ringing. So I think maybe there was a part of him that felt maybe I should do this. And then I think he's lived in Chicago before. He loves the city. In the interview process, I think Chris Getz did a good sell job and won him over. And I think he was almost attracted to the idea of being able to be a manager who has kind of a footprint on the entire organization. It maybe wouldn't be that way if he went to manage the Mets or even the Guardians. They have a very analytical front office. Their systems are well established. I think Venable's a guy who really likes the details and the nitty-gritty, and Getz sold him on kind of a partnership, which I know he's talked about before. But he can be a manager. We know they're bad at infield positioning. I think he's going to have a hand in, okay, how do we revamp this? And some of this, gets into little stuff, probably goes beyond my understanding, but he's going to have a say in player development, maybe even in player acquisition. I'm sure he'll at least be involved in the recruiting process. He'll be a little bit of an all-encompassing modern manager. I think AJ Hinch is very much that in Detroit. So in a way, I see some similarities between maybe the types of managers they want to be. So you combine that with the fact that I just think he felt he was ready maybe, everyone thought he was Bruce Bochy's heir, but does anyone really know when Bruce Bochy's going to retire? The Rangers hired Skip Schumacher right after Venable left. Was that in the
Yeah.
works before? Don't fully know the answer to those questions. Will swore to me there was no dynamic change, but that makes you wonder. So you combine all that together, and I do think he actually felt it was the right fit at the right time for him, even though there's obviously a really daunting challenge ahead.
Well, again, it's an excellent feature. We put the link into the podcast post at soxmachine.com. You can also check it out on theathletic.com. Excellent work about the Will Venable experience, becoming White Sox manager. Cody, moving over to Detroit. What a late season run in 2024. On July 2nd, 2024, the Tigers were 38-47. They finish 86-76. They get the wild card bid. We saw that as White Sox fans because when the Tigers clinched the wild card, the White Sox lost 121, and the Tigers shocked everyone. They upset the Houston Astros in the American League wild card series. They took Cleveland to the brink in the ALDS, losing in Game 5. If that goes the other way, the Tigers would have made the American League Championship Series. Again, 9 games below 500 on July 2nd and so close to reaching the ALCS. And Cody, how did they follow that up from that late season run? What kind of momentum and what kind of activity did they have this offseason to try to build on what they had in the second half?
Yeah, I think at the outset of the offseason, a lot of us were kind of asking, does this make the path forward clearer, or does it almost make it more murky a little bit? Because does it accelerate their timeline? Would it make them more aggressive in free agency? If they beat their own expectations, which I think they kind of did, will they stick the course of building around all this young talent? And I guess now that we're here in spring training, the answer was kind of somewhere in the middle. This is a team that still has some major offensive question marks. They added only one hitter. It was Gleyber Torres. They moved Colt Keith to first base. They really like Torres's bat. They liked that he's young, still has some upside. Didn't cost a draft pick to sign him. If he has a good year, they could give him the qualifying offer, receive a draft pick. So they said no to Christian Walker. I think they had some interest in Carlos Santana, but they ultimately seemed to like Torres the most of any of these infielders on the market, even though their infield defense might now be a problem. So they added him, and they pursued Alex Bregman until the very end. And they surprised a lot of people by being willing to offer 6 years. So in a way, they were more aggressive. They didn't end up getting him. So it leaves you with some question marks. The Tigers have gotten pretty good with what they're doing on pitching. Jack Flaherty's market did not materialize. They got him back on a pretty team-friendly deal 1 year with an opt-out. They signed Alex Cobb. That was a little bit of a surprising signing. 1 year, $15 million for a 37-year-old guy who's been hurt a lot. He's already hurt. Hip inflammation. Won't be ready for opening day. And then a couple bullpen additions, former White Sox Tommy Kahnle and former Chicago White Sox John Brebbia. So two guys, Kahnle's had a lot of success, and Brebbia, they kind of think they can fix him. They're really attracted to his fastball. So some good additions, but not necessarily a huge splash. They think they're going to get better if they're young hitters, Riley Green, Colt Keith, Jace Young now at third base, Parker Meadows take a step forward. They really seem to think that's their path to following up on last year.
So the strength, when I'm looking at this Tigers team, Cody, is still the starting rotation, especially their front three with Tarik Skubal. You mentioned Jack Flaherty, Reese Olson. Who's filling out the back end of this rotation, though? Is it time? Is it finally Jackson Jobe time? We've been hearing about this guy for years now. Is it time for him to break out?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions, one of the key storylines in spring training. With Cobb now expected to begin the year on the IL, they're going to have 2 open rotation spots. Just watching Jackson Jobe a couple days ago, man, it's going to be tough to leave this kid off the opening day roster. He made his debut late last year out of the pen in the postseason run. He's not guaranteed a roster spot. It does bring up questions like, would they gamble with his service time, or would they want to start him on the opening day roster, try to get a draft pick that way? I don't know for sure, but he easily has the best sheer stuff of anyone outside Tarik Skubal, and in terms of just pure potency, I would argue better than Skubal. He still has to work on some stuff, pitch execution, fastball command. kind of these vague terms. You could see a Scott Harris press conference where he's like, yes, we want Jackson Jobe to work on locating all four pitches to all four quadrants. And it's like, come on, man. I think he has a good chance to be in the rotation. Starter, I think a lot's going to depend on what the Tigers want to do with one Kenta Maeda, who they signed to a 2-year deal last offseason, and he had a terrible year. ERA above 6. But he's come to camp looking better, throwing harder. Are they willing to run that back? I don't think they're going to eat $10 million. He ended the year in the bullpen. I get the sense the Tigers would like to try to give this another run with Maeda as a starter, but he's got a lot of competition. One of them's a former number 1 overall pick, Casey Mize. What are you going to do with him? That's a great question. So I think it could be between Maeda and Mize for that 5th spot, but you have other guys, Matt Manning, Cater Montero, Ty Madden, Brant Herter. I could keep rattling off some names. It's going to be real competition, and some of it's almost based on what the front office wants to do in the bigger picture with Jobe and when to put him in the rotation, and with Maeda, which is a little bit of a problem. What do you do there?
Yeah, all pitchers are ticking time bombs, right? Especially with injuries. It's one thing to say the Tigers definitely have pitching depth in case of injury, but again, that depth can get hurt as well in AAA. So I'm kind of with you. Like, I would like, from a Tigers perspective, I would like to see them go at Jackson Jobe. But if you're not 100% confident in Casey Mize and his ability to execute, does he have any options left? Could they send him to AAA and see if Kenta Maeda has anything left in the tank? And if he doesn't, they can swap out in June with Mize?
Yeah, I believe Mize has an option remaining, so I think it is entirely possible he could start the year in Toledo, which is a little bit weird to say. There's also a world in which Mize or Matt Manning, another former first round pick, could be candidates. I think one of them could move to the bullpen at some point this year if there is a need. The Tigers also have enough depth where there's maybe not a pressing need, but as these guys kind of get to the end of their run and it hasn't quite worked for them as starters, I think that transition could be a possibility for at least one of them. So there are going to be some pretty interesting and big decisions made regarding two formerly highly touted prospects. I'm not totally sure how it's going to shake out.
Well, this is a White Sox podcast, so excuse me for being a bit dour with this next topic. But last year, the trade deadline, the Tigers were 52 at 57. They were 5 games below 500. Nobody got a good sense of what the Tigers were going to do. They ended up selling a little bit. They still made the postseason. In 2025, Cody, if the Tigers are back in the same spot, if they're 5 games below 500 with the trade deadline coming up, Tarik Skubal has one more year of control after this season where the arbitration. And White Sox fans had to go through this with Garrett Crochet last year. He ultimately didn't get traded, but he did get traded during the offseason. If the Tigers are in a similar spot and they struggle in the first half of the season, are we going to hear rumors about Tarik Skubal possibly being dealt?
I'm glad you bring this up because I'm not sure enough people are talking about it and how real of a scenario it could be, even though it's not necessarily a fun one for Tigers fans to think about. That seems very real. Tarik Skubal is a Scott Boras client. The chances of the Tigers being able to extend Tarik Skubal, I would venture to say, are astronomically low. There's one way it would happen. Tarik Skubal would just have to go to Boras and say, I really want to be here. I don't care how much advice you're giving me. I think they could offer him $1 billion and Boras would still test the market. And let's see if the Yankees will offer $1.1 billion. So if you're not going to be able to re-sign him, which is probably a long shot, you have to face the reality it might be best to trade him. And if the Tigers get off to a poor start or have a poor first half, if a couple of the wrong injuries happen or a couple of the young hitters don't take the steps forward they're hoping for, that could be such a reality. And it's a little bit awkward. Or even if they have a great year, would it be a Corbin Burns situation and they have to think about trading him in the offseason? Now, the Tigers do like their draft picks. Maybe they'd be content to run the course of 6 years, give them the qualifying offer, take a draft pick. But there's a real argument the best use of value would be to eventually trade Tarik Skubal. I guess the best case scenario is you can have a good year and kick that conversation to the offseason rather than the trade deadline. There are going to be rumors. I promise you. Will those rumors be real? Hard to say, but we are going to hear a lot more about this.
Yeah, I'm sure Scott Boras and even Tarik Skubal himself were very happy when Max Fried signed that 8-year contract with the New York Yankees for $218 million. I have to assume Skubal, if he hits free agency, he's beating that AAV. Maybe he gets 8 years. I don't know. 8 years, $240 million. Is that too much for a Tarik
What's
Skubal?
Garrett Cole's deal?
Oh, it's like
Do we know?
312 million, like 12 years or
I
something
think
like
that
that.
is framed on a poster somewhere as a deal they would like to beat.
Well, good luck. He's got the stuff. I mean, if he has another Cy Young year this year, he definitely could. He's the best pitcher in this division, the best pitcher in the American League right now. The Tigers, from my perspective, they really need a strong first half, because if not, and Skubal is still dealing, and they're 52 and 57 at the trade deadline, Cody, I think you're going to be busy. I just think there's going to be so many rumors and so many teams knocking on the door, willing to give up more than what Boston gave up for Garrett Crochet, which could help out the Tigers in the near future, especially offensively, because you mentioned Gleyber Torres. And I wanted to chat with you about him a little bit. One, how is he still only 28 years old? I swear this is his 15th season in the major leagues. I've been hearing about Gleyber Torres for 15 years. Now, I think he provides a boost offensively, as you mentioned, because outside of Riley Green and Kerry Carpenter, the Tigers weren't a team that scared you offensively. Any thoughts, or what have you been seeing and hearing in spring training for the Tigers to try to generate more runs in 2025?
Yeah, like I said, they're really banking on these young players. The name I'd point to is Colt Keith. You look at the overall stat line from his rookie year, not that great, but he had a miserable first month. And from, I think, the middle of May on, he hit 285 the rest of the season. So he's got great bat to ball skills. The kid can hit the ball a long way when he connects, but I think it was 13 home runs last year. Now he's playing first base. They do need him to tap into the power a little bit more. But I am a pretty big believer in Colt Keith's bat. He's really got a good hit tool, and he's 6'4" and jacked. There's no reason he shouldn't be able to up the power a little bit. So they're looking there. They're looking at Parker Meadows and center. This guy had a 800 plus OPS, I think from August on. I don't know that he's the type of hitter who's going to replicate that. But again, another guy who got off to a very poor start. He got sent down. He came back up and he was great. If you can get somewhere in the middle, they think Meadows could be a 3-4 win player. He's good enough defender. It's not out of the realm of possibility. They think Riley Green can even be better. He was an all-star last year. Could he take a step forward to MVP vote getter? And there's some more players, Matt Vierling, Winsel Perez, other guys kind of more on the fringes of their roster who they think they can get a little bit more out of. In a way, it's a risky proposition because you're saying if with every one of those guys.
Right.
You only brought in the one proven steady production in Gleyber. Spencer Torkelson, who knows if he's even going to be on the roster? I don't know. But you have some talent here, and you have to really bank on these guys getting a little bit better. Being around baseball, I bet a couple of them will get better, and a couple of them won't take that step forward. So what does that mean? I think it means you're going to have really good pitching again, which is entirely possible given the talent on this staff. But the Tigers also had allowed the third fewest runs in franchise history since 1968 last season, if that makes any sense. So what that tells me is, like, you could be really good and it's still going to be very hard to replicate last year's performance.
Yeah, you mentioned Spencer Torkelson, and Detroit fans are going through the same thing White Sox fans are going through. This highly touted, highly drafted first baseman out of college, just not living up to expectations. For the White Sox, it's Andrew Vaughn. The White Sox are still planning on having Vaughn at first base. They gave him that arbitration contract. He's going to be making close to $6 million. With Torkelson, I feel like Detroit, even though they drafted Torkelson a year later than the White Sox drafted Andrew Vaughn, are they ready to give up on Torkelson? It seems like they're more ready to give up on their highly touted first baseman draftee than the White Sox are.
Yeah, I don't think your assessment is wrong. Torkelson and Vaughn, both Bay Area kids, had the same hitting coach in high school, were both great college players. The Tigers, when they signed Gleyber, it put Spencer Torkelson kind of on the outs. It seemed, although it was a vote of confidence in Gleyber Torres, it also seemed to me a little bit like an indictment of Spencer Torkelson. He's in a competition in camp. There's a world where if he rakes, maybe they'd be content to carry him and have him DH against left-handed pitching and be available for late game at bats. Otherwise, that's a pretty high standard for his bat, especially he's only playing first base and DH. He is not playing outfield, not playing third base. That makes it hard for me to see a roster spot. Now, Tigers officials swear it's legit. They would like him to hit well and make this team. Um, but it might be tough. And I don't think expectations are high. I think if it didn't happen and they moved on, I think they made that decision when they signed Gleyber Torres. But it's like, okay, we have him. If he hits great, he's available on the bench. Maybe we can still get something out of this. That would be like a pleasant surprise. But if it doesn't happen this year, I mean, I don't know if they're going to trade him. It's a good enough bat, a guy you keep in your organization as long as you can while he's cheap. There's a lot worse depth to have in AAA, but I don't necessarily think they're projecting him as part of the future anymore.
What's the plan at shortstop for Detroit? Is it still Javier Baez or is it the Trey Sweeney show?
Oof, another one of these great questions. Javi Baez, he had hip surgery. He's coming into camp. He's looking pretty good. He was about the worst qualifying hitter in baseball last season when he was healthy. It's hard to have any expectations there. I think he's going to be on this roster. I don't think they're just going to eat that money this season. How much will he play? Will he play every day? Will he only play against lefties? I don't know. Trey Sweeney is in the mix, but he's not even guaranteed a roster spot. You try to write out a Tigers lineup against left-handed hitters, and you suddenly realize it'll be very hard for Detroit to carry Trey Sweeney at shortstop, Jace Young at third base, and Zach McKinstry, a utility guy who also plays shortstop. I think it's a world where they would either have to carry McKinstry or Sweeney, and Sweeney is the only one of those players who has an option. But that means you're starting Javi Baez and Zach McKinstry as your shortstops. Can you feel good about that? Shortstop is a huge glaring question mark any way you cut it. Baez is pretty good with the glove. Sweeney's pretty good with the glove. But any of those three players, Baez, Sweeney, McKinstry, you're not feeling really good about the offensive production. Yeah, I think the biggest question of the whole thing is just like, how much is Javi Baez going to play? Are they even going to attempt to get him to be an everyday player again? It's a little bit hard to say at this point.
So with Scott Harris coming from the Chicago Cubs, does he have anything from his old bag of tricks working with that franchise that could maybe unlock something with Javi Baez? Because when hearing this about the shortstop position, it immediately goes back to this offseason, Cody. I'm like, well, why wasn't Detroit in the Willy Adames market? Well, you can't be if you're already paying Javi Baez. I think we talked about it in a previous episode, Sox Machine podcast, like 3 years, like $70+ million are left on that contract, and no one's going to trade for that either. So I guess, does Scott Harris have any answers for the Javi Baez question?
Yeah, Scott Harris did not sign Javi Baez. That was done under the Al Avila regime. So Scott Harris's introductory press conference 2.5 years ago, he was asked this very question. And I think he said, yeah, we think there are some things we can do to help him get better. And that didn't happen. And then the next offseason, it was kind of like, yeah, we think we can cut down his swing or reduce the core or get his hips more mobile. That didn't help. So then it was like the last ditch effort seems to be, let's have him get this surgery, see if we can get his body back moving a little bit better. The thing people don't realize about Javi Baez, he still chases all the time. His strikeout rate has declined in a big way in his time in Detroit. It's dropped 10 percentage points. He doesn't actually strike out that much anymore, but he has no power. I mean, the power, the good Javi moments just seem to be completely gone. So maybe if he feels a little bit better physically, you could get a little bit more out of that. But, I always thought it was just a profile that it was hard to see Javi being a player who's aging well. Now he's on the other side of 30. Now he's coming off a surgery. This feels like a last ditch effort to fix the hip. Maybe you get a little bit more out of it. I think they've tried everything else.
Is there any appetite from ownership to be able to just cut ties and eat the cash like the Houston Astros did with Jose Abreu?
Yeah. Hard to say. I mean, if he's just unplayable, you would think it's a conversation, but I'm not sure it's going to be this year. I think if there are 2 years left on the deal, 1 year left on the deal, it becomes a little more palatable. $73 million is a lot of money. So I don't know, but I don't really get that sense.
And then finally, so it sounds like Detroit has to win games like they did in the second half of last year. Outstanding pitching, scored 3 to 4 runs, and hold on. So manager AJ Hinch, he was staring at a 4th straight losing season. And you know how it is in Major League Baseball, Cody. Managers don't get that long of a run if they start off that many losing seasons. But the second half, winning a postseason series, even though the Tigers are 307 and 341 under Hinch after 4 seasons, in year 5, I'm assuming, Cody, that last year and that surprise run means that Hinch's job security is safe coming into 2025?
Yeah, I think AJ Hinch has as much job security as any manager in baseball. Coming off a good year, he signed a contract extension before that season. And again, this was an inherited hire. Al Avila hired AJ Hinch. Scott Harris not only kept him, but then extended him. We don't know the length of his extension, but I have reason to believe it's kind of a long time. So I think it would take more than one bad year for AJ Hinch to go anywhere. He's a very talented, creative, cunning manager. I've always said, like, wouldn't it be nice if to give him like a real roster to build around? Mm-hmm. And obviously there is some talent here. This is a much better roster than it was even 2 years ago. But it's still a roster that could be a little bit volatile. So in a way, if things go poorly, like, is that a reflection of Hinch? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I guess that's always one of the great questions with managers, but he has good people skills. He appears to be well liked in the clubhouse. I think it would take a lot more than one bad season for anything to change there.
Well, his job would get a lot harder if the offense doesn't click. They're below 500, and Scott Harris gets an offer he can't pass for Tarik Skubal. Like, that second half's not going to go well for Detroit. So it'd be really hard to grade AJ Hinch because I think more of the onus for Detroit is up with the front office.
But in a way, Josh, it was kind of important that they did what they did in the second half, because otherwise we'd be sitting here and saying, okay, AJ's been here 4 years.
Yeah.
They've had 4 losing seasons. They've had some young talent. None of it's developed under his watch. Like, what are we sure this guy's so smart? And instead they do pitching chaos and they win a bunch of games and he's number 1 on best manager list. I think that just all goes to show you manager is a hard job. And like I've thought this with Will Venable. Will Venable seems so smart and he could do a great job. And the chances of Will Venable getting fired in 4 or 5 years, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if the White Sox go 61 and 101, Will Venable might get Manager of the Year votes. That's a 20-win improvement for the White Sox.
Right?
And then looking at season expectations for Detroit, Fangraphs is projecting 82 and 80 for the Tigers, second place, a very tough race in the AL Central. Baseball Prospectus is also projecting a tough race in the AL Central. They're projecting 79-83 for the Tigers. And for the betting folks, the sports books currently right now have the over-under at 83.5 wins. Cody, I'm assuming it's AL Central or bust for the Tigers. That's the expectation. Get back into the postseason.
Yeah, they'd like to win this division. This is kind of the first time AJ Hinch has ever said anything like that outright. In the past, he's talked about, hey, we have to earn the right to even talk like that. Well, coming off a playoff appearance, he said in December, our goal is to win the AL Central. So that's what they're going for. That line, 83.5, like, man, I don't know what I would take, because that seems about right if I had to guess. Maybe AJ can squeeze a couple more wins out of them. I have a hard time seeing a 90-win version of this team that wins the AL Central easily. It is going to be a tough division. There are a lot of teams that are all good, not great. So it might be one of those things where all these predictions are silly. It might come down to who stays healthy.
Yeah, that's a good point. I still think this is a 4-team race, which makes it very entertaining if you're not a White Sox fan. But yeah, Minnesota, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, it's going to be a tight race throughout the entire season. That's why we wanted to start these previews, because it does get me excited for baseball. Even if the White Sox are better and if they still lose 100 games, baseball in the American League Central will be very competitive. It will be a tight race throughout the 2025 season. You could read Cody's excellent work about the Detroit Tigers and Major League Baseball in general at The Athletic. You can follow him on Twitter. He's at Cody Stavenhagen, and he's got a podcast as well. It's excellent. I listen to it all the time to catch up on what's going on with Detroit. It's called Tiger Territory. You can listen to that podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And Cody, as always, thanks for joining the Sox Machine podcast.
Yeah, sure thing, Josh. Anytime.
That will do it for this episode of the Sox Machine podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll have a new episode for you guys on Monday nights covering and recapping the weekend that was Chicago White Sox spring training baseball. Maybe we'll get more news on what's going on with Justin Ishbia and the ownership structure of the Chicago White Sox. Whatever news that we have, we'll share it with you guys as we record on Monday night, as James Fegan and Jim Margulis join me for that podcast episode. But thank you so much for listening to this show. If you just discovered the Sox Machine podcast, you can subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, such as Spotify and Apple Music. You could also listen and watch the show at our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Sox Machine. Follow us on social media. We're on all the platforms at Sox Machine. You can follow James at JR Fegan. You can follow me at SoxMachine_Josh. If you would like to have full access to all of our coverage of the Chicago White Sox and Major League Baseball, you can sign up at patreon.com/Sox Machine, where our Patreon supporters get ad-free versions of both the podcast and website and additional perks as well. It helps us greatly in covering the White Sox and allows James Fegan to travel down to Arizona and covering spring training for us. So for all of those that support Sox Machine already on Patreon, thank you so much. For those that haven't, you can sign up at patreon.com/Sox Machine. Monthly plans start at $5. The Sox Machine podcast is a production of SoxMachine.com. You're on for all things Chicago White Sox baseball and part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Josh Nelson. Thanks for listening and watching.